This morning, picking back up in 2 Corinthians, we're going to be looking at working out the desirous will of God. This is in 2 Corinthians chapter 7. We'll be working through, starting in verse 11 and working through chapter 8, verse 5. As we're coming into this, remember in 2 Corinthians chapter 7, verses 2 through 3, Paul was talking about how they have wronged no one. Paul did not come in a way to where he was intending to take anything from anybody. He was bringing the truth to them, and they were very dear to him. And Paul was actually very bold towards them, in speaking about them to others also. And we see this in 2 Corinthians chapter 7, verse 4 through 6. He was not intending, really, he did have a very soft spot for them. But his first letter had to be written because they needed some correction. But that didn't mean he was casting them out. And then he talks about godly grief in 2 Corinthians chapter 7, verses 8 through 10. And of course, remember, grief from the world system works out death. But grief from God really works out repentance. That is a changing of the mind. God allows grief to come upon us because we're doing things that we shouldn't be doing, and he wants us to change our minds. That is what it's there for. And of course, some of that can be discipline as a result of our own actions. Now, in 2 Corinthians chapter 7 and verse 11, he goes on to talk about godly grief worked out in all of you. So yeah, they grieved, but it was a godly grief, and it was working out in them. So we first see this concept of him being worked out in 2 Corinthians chapter 7 and verse 11. It says, "For look with discernment, this same thing according to God you grieved, working out with much diligence in you. But a verbal defense, but an irritation, but a fear, but a longing, but a zeal, but a vindication, in all setting yourselves to be set apart in this matter." So he starts out with this working out, and you can see that the grieving of God worked out in much diligence. Now, this, of course, word diligence is used in a couple of other areas, and especially in relation to our Christian life and how we use the things that we have in salvation. We need to be working them out. We need to be using them. We see an example of the working out of our faith over in 2 Peter chapter 1 and verse 5. Here it says, "Indeed, having brought aside this same thing, work out with your faith the moral excellence, and with the moral excellence the knowledge." Now, in the context here, what he's talking about is the fact that we have all things pertaining to life and godliness. All things pertaining to life and godliness. And we need to use them. We need to actually apply them to our lives. 2 Peter chapter 1 and verse 3, "Seeing that his divine power has granted to us everything pertaining to life and godliness, through the true knowledge," actually the word true there would be full experiential knowledge, "of him who called us by his own glory and excellence." So in relation to the fact of in our salvation, we have everything we need to apply it. If you're going to have faith in God, you need to actually use your faith. Otherwise, really, and James talks about this, what good is faith if faith does not have works? It does not work the other way around. You cannot produce faith from works. But faith definitely produces works because you take somebody at their word. You believe them. So that's going to impact your actions. Then he goes on to talk about it also worked out a verbal defense. Because, hey, they got called to the mat, you could say. They were doing some things that were inappropriate. It's like, really, are you taking God at his word? Are you being obedient or not? And this verbal defense used in a couple of areas, but we especially see this in 1 Peter chapter 3 and verse 15, where it's talking about setting apart Christ as Lord. In 1 Peter chapter 3 and verse 15, it says, "But sanctify Christ as Lord in your heart." Now remember, your word sanctify means to set apart. "Always ready to make a defense to everyone who asks you to give an account for the hope that is in you, yet with meekness and reverence." It doesn't actually use the word gentleness. I know some translations use gentleness. Meekness, remember, it's an objectivity of mind. Keep the focus. Why do you believe what you believe is really what it's saying. When somebody asks you, why do you believe this? You should be able to give a proper defense of that. And it should not be because, well, this is what everybody says. I should actually be able to give a proper verbal defense to defend what I believe. This, by the way, does not require you to be a theologian. Why do I say that in order to be saved, you have to believe that Christ died for your sins, was buried, and rose again on the third day? I say that because 1 Corinthians chapter 15, verses 1 through 4 specifically state that is the gospel by which we are saved. So if you want to argue that point, you're not arguing it with me anymore. You're arguing it with Scripture and what Scripture actually says. But if I say you have to accept Jesus into your heart, what defense do I have there? Well, some will take, passages like Revelation chapter 3, and they'll say Jesus is knocking at the door of your heart, even though you look at the context, your defense would fall apart pretty quickly because that door is the door of the church. Or over in Romans where they say you have to confess, you have to confess Jesus in order to actually be saved. So you have to confess with your mouth. Yet in context, it's very clear he's talking to the Jews, and the Jews understood who Jesus would be. They understood who their Messiah was, or the fact that they had to acknowledge that, but you still have the resurrection of Christ involved in there. So I'm saying make Jesus the Lord of your life, that's not a gospel, and you can't defend that because it's not defensible. Some will come here into 1 Peter chapter 3 and they'll try to use this as the passage, but in the context, who is Peter talking to? People who are already saved. So Christ should be set apart as Lord in our lives. Remember, he is our master, and we should be able to give a defense that is a verbal defense as to why we believe what we believe. Why do we have hope in this situation? And again, it doesn't require you to be a major theologian. All Christians should be able to do this. Why do I actually have hope? Paul was appointed to the defense of the gospel. Now, that's your verbal defense that he was giving in Philippians chapter 1, verses 15 through 16. Some, to be sure, are preaching Christ even from envy and strife, but some also from goodwill. Remember in the context here, Paul is in prison, and there's some going around actually preaching Christ so that they can cause more problems for Paul in prison. I mean, yeah, they're going around saying, "Oh, well, Paul, he's teaching that Christ raised from the dead, and all of the things that related to the salvation that Paul was actually teaching." They were doing that on purpose to aggravate the Jews more, to persecute Paul more. How absurd is that? But yet there were some who were actually honest about it, and they actually did believe. The latter do it out of love, knowing that I am appointed to the defense of the gospel. And he verbally defended quite well, so well. What was the response of the Jews? Yeah, kill him. Why did they want to kill him? Because we cannot actually defend ourselves against him. They did the same thing with Christ. Christ explained very clearly from Scripture, and it fit. It worked perfectly, and they're like, kill him, because we can't defend ourselves against that. Because he was speaking the truth. And then we have this word irritation. It's not always translated as irritation. Sometimes it's translated as indignation. But I don't think this is actually a really good word for indignation. We actually have the word indignation over in Ephesians chapter 4 and verse 26. And the word indignation would really be more of an expression of something alongside of your wrath. So here in Ephesians chapter 4 and verse 26, it says, "Be angry and yet do not sin. Do not let the sun go down on it actually says your indignation, that which is beside the wrath. So that process within the mind, the mentality of that explosive wrath, it should be not permitted to actually remain overnight. Like, deal with your wrath. Don't sin. Don't dwell on it. That's more of your word for indignation. Where this other word really kind of has more of a focus on physical pain or vexation, but not in the sense of intense physical pain, more like an irritation. That's probably a better way of actually expressing this. They were being irritated by the fact that what Paul was calling them out for was, well, in some cases it was accurate, but it's like, hey, wait a minute, this is not who we are. What you're presenting here, this is not truly who we are. And then they were to do it in fear. And of course, fear would be in respect. Fear involves working out holiness. 2 Corinthians chapter 7 and verse 1, here it says, therefore, having these promises, beloved, let us cleanse ourselves from all defilement of the flesh and spirit, while filling up holiness in the fear of God. That's respect. That's not living up to what God's expectations of us are. We should actually have fear of that, because we're not actually using what God has provided for us. What we're trying to do is do it by our own means, and it's not going to measure up. So in the fear that he's talking about in the context here, because we go right back into verse 1, same chapter, he's talking about this fear related to filling up that holiness, living a life that truly does show that we are ones who are separated unto God, and doing that in respect. We should also have fear, and he just previously dealt with this, in relation to how we actually build. Because we are going to answer for our works before the throne. Well, excuse me, the reward seat. It's not the throne, it's the reward seat. Now, Paul had just dealt with this, 2 Corinthians chapter 5, verses 10 through 11. For it is necessary all of us appear before the reward seat of Christ, in order that we should receive each one the things through the body towards what was done, whether good or bad. Therefore, knowing the fear of the Lord, we persuade humans, and we are manifested to God, and we also hope to be manifested in your conscience. Why? Because we are all going to stand before the reward seat. And that should cause fear. It's not a fear of God rejecting us. It's a fear of really not measuring up to what we potentially could be. Now, again, this isn't self-effort. The only way we can fail is because we want to do it ourselves and we don't take God at his word. That's the only way we can fail. When we're building something, if we're trying to do it ourselves, it will fail. But if we let God do the work through us, remember, he has prepared good works for us to do beforehand. He prepared them. There was a concept of this, trying to do it yourself in contrast to God doing it. What was this statement that it's do something so big that unless God's involved, it'll fail? And that's the wrong mentality. Because what am I saying? I'm going to go do what I want, and if perhaps God's okay with it, it'll be successful. But if he's not, it'll fail. That's a terrible mindset. How about use what God has actually given to you so that it does actually succeed? Because God always finishes what he starts. Always. And then he goes on to talk about how it worked out longing in them. Now, this longing is for Paul, a reminder of who Paul was. Now, again, remember, and we'll get more into this as we go through this 2 Corinthians, Paul is dealing with some people who are claiming to be apostles, and they're coming in and basically talking him down and saying, Paul isn't really worth what you think. But they understood that that wasn't true. They actually ultimately test him and kick him out. And not only in his coming, but also in the encouragement that he was encouraged on the basis of you while announcing to us your longing, your lamenting, your zeal concerning me. That's 2 Corinthians chapter 7 and verse 7. Right in the context there, that's what he's talking about. This is their longing, and that longing for Paul. And of course, in the same verse, he's talking about zeal. That zeal for Paul, 2 Corinthians chapter 7 and verse 7, same thing where he's longing, your lamentation, or you're lamenting, your zeal concerning me. Because they really did have a zeal concerning Paul. But they were very carnal, and they were getting into some things that they should not have. Because in the first letter that he writes to them, he talks about the fact that they're carnal. Why? Because one is saying, I'm of Paul, I'm of Apollos, I'm of Christ. There was divisions in the church, and that comes from the flesh. That does not come from the Spirit. And then this vindication. Now, in the context here, vindication is interesting because it's typically used of God bringing vindication. We see this over in Romans chapter 12 and verse 19, where it says, never take your own revenge. That's a terrible translation, but anyway, we'll go with it. Beloved, but leave room for the wrath of God, for it is written, vengeance is mine, I will repay the Lord. Now that part is actually a good translation of it. Then vengeance is mine. He's saying vengeance isn't for you, it's mine. It actually uses the word vindication, but vengeance would be how it's being expressed. Taking vindication on the disobedient, on all disobedience. Now that should be something we are actually doing. Is bringing things in relation to in relation to disobedience. 2 Corinthians chapter 10 and verse 6, he says, and we are ready to punish disobedience. Well, your word punish there is vindicate. Vindicate ourselves so that we are being obedient. It needs to be called out for that disobedience needs to be called out for what it is. They were to set themselves apart in these things, and they did. As a response to the grief that was brought upon them by Paul's letter, their reaction was, in response to God's correction, they corrected it. And in doing that, they actually did set themselves apart. They were vindicated. They're saying, hey, no, this is not who we are. This is not how we're going to live out the Christian life and be known. We are going to live this out. And now in 2 Corinthians chapter 7 and verse 12 through 16, Paul talks about why he wrote the first letter. It begins with their diligence, and this is in 2 Corinthians chapter 7 and verse 12. And here he says, then since also I wrote to you, not on account of the one doing wrong, but on account of the one, not on the account of the one being wronged, but on account to manifest your diligence, the diligence concerning us facing you before God. Now, again, you'll notice in the context here, he says, I didn't write to you because of the one that was doing wrong, or because of the one that was actually being wrong. I wrote for your diligence, because you need to correct this. You need to handle this. So what Paul is referring to here is the one who committed an egregious sin over in 1 Corinthians chapter 5 and verse 1. In 1 Corinthians 5:1, it says, it is actually reported that there is immorality among you, and immorality of such a kind as does not exist even among the Gentiles, that someone has his father's wife. That immorality is actually a word for fornication. Not even the Gentiles would do this, and they were acceptant of this person who was blatantly showing this sinful type of a lifestyle, and Paul called them out for it. Because they're looking at saying, look at how gracious we're being, and Paul saying, hey, no. That person should not be permitted in the church, and they should be cast out of the church. There's nothing wrong with being merciful and kind and gracious to people, but you don't permit sin to be in the church. Sin is not, the church isn't the place for sin. The church is the place for the saints to come together to grow and mature and to overcome sin. You don't bring somebody into your assembly that's blatantly sinning. And in this case, this person needed to be separated from the assembly. So their diligence in doing what is right. And Paul was not interested in dictating to them every aspect of their Christian life. He's saying, hey, you guys understand this stuff. You need to apply it properly. And I know you can. Paul had confidence in them that they could actually do it right. It was their diligence to do what is right. So Paul's letter was not only for correcting a wrong, but to show their diligence towards him that, yeah, they actually do believe what he said. And they're going to apply it correctly. The comfort of Paul because of their reaction to his letter then comes next in 2 Corinthians chapter 7 and verse 13. Here he says, because of this we are comforted, and upon your encouragement we more abundantly rejoice upon the joy of Titus, because his spirit was refreshed from all of you. So he sees their reaction, and it very much encouraged Paul. Because remember, Paul regretted having to send the letter, although he didn't regret what he wrote in the letter. But it wasn't like Paul was like, oh, you guys are messing up, I'll write you a letter. Paul really, he's like, I either come and correct you that way, but I'm going to be very harsh, or I'm going to write a letter and I'm going to give you the opportunity to correct it yourself. And he was hoping their reaction would be they corrected themselves, and they did. And that's really encouraged him. And now, and of course, we have Paul boasting about them. And the reality is, because of their reaction to his letter, it proved his boasting was true. 2 Corinthians chapter 7, verse 14. Because since what I have boasted to him concerning you, I am not put to shame, but as always in truth we speak to you, thus also our boasting of you, the one upon Titus, has come to be true. Because yeah, Paul was saying the Corinthians will take care of the situation. They'll provide, and they did. So his boasting in relation to that did actually work out. And Titus, of course, was then encouraged by them also. 2 Corinthians chapter 7, verse 15. And his affections are abundant unto all of you, while remembering the obedience of all of you, as with fear and trembling you received him. They received him with respect, understanding who he was and who he came from, listening to what he was actually saying. Paul has confidence in them. And Paul, of course, from the very beginning, he really did have confidence in them. He wanted them to correct it. A lot of times this is the situation with the Christian life. It is not about somebody telling you what to do. It's about you applying the truth. You actually, in that situation, applying the truth and determining it, not waiting for somebody to actually give you the answers. 2 Corinthians chapter 7 and verse 16, I rejoice because in all I have confidence in you. Now think about that, especially with the first letter where they were called out pretty harshly for some of the things they were doing. And yet Paul here in his second letter is saying, hey, I actually do have confidence in you. Then he goes on to talk about the love of the Macedonian saints. The Macedonian saints had an incredible amount of love, and they're going to express this love in their actions because they're seeking to do what is best for those who are loved. In 2 Corinthians chapter 8 and starting in verse 8, chapter 8 and verse 1, we have the grace from God given to the assemblies in Macedonia. Now, here it says, and we will make known to you, brethren, the grace from God, the one given in the assemblies of Macedonia. So he's going to explain what they were actually doing. Their willingness to actually give stunned Paul. It really did, because they did it correctly. 2 Corinthians chapter 8, verses 2 through 3 that in much proof from tribulation, the abundance of their joy, and according to the depths of their poverty, abounded unto the riches of their sincerity, because according to their ability, I testify, and above their ability, willingly. Now, what he's talking about is the Macedonian saints decided that they were going to take up a collection for the saints in Jerusalem. Now, why would they need to take up a collection for the saints in Jerusalem? Well, go back to the very beginning of the church. What did they do? They all came together, they sold their property, they all kind of lived together in a communal type of a sense. But the problem was, nobody was producing money. They were all using it. And, you know, it was fine while things were coming in, because remember, the church at the beginning was actually very large. It was well over 10,000 members. And that would be males, not counting everybody else. It was a very large assembly. And, you know, they had wealth and they brought it together and they shared it together. God never instructed them to actually do that, although we are instructed to love one another, which means we should be taking care of the needs of each other. So if somebody is in need, we should never ignore that. But that doesn't mean that we share everything we have with another person, because what ends up happening? Nobody has anything. Yeah, socialists and communism, that's what happens. You know, it's kind of funny. It's exactly the same thing in the world system. You get all these people with wealth and everything, and they want to bring it all together, and everybody wants to share, but nobody's producing anything. And by the end of it, they ran out of money. Well, what happens if you run out of money? You've sold your land. You can be extremely poor. And they were very poor. They were not as poor as the Macedonian saints, which is kind of interesting. The Macedonian saints were actually poorer than those in Jerusalem. But yet they decided they were going to take up a collection for them. They asked Paul to give them this favor, because Paul was saying, no. You guys, how could you even give them anything? You know, he understood how poor they were. Remember, he's with them. He understands. But they're like, no, this is something we want to do. And they asked Paul to do this favor for them. You can say grace, but really the focus here is more on doing us a favor, because it's that aspect of grace. After much encouragement, while asking us the favor and fellowship of the ministry, the ones unto the saints. So it took some encouragement from them, and then asking for, not only do they want this favor from them, but they also want to share in the ministry of the saints. That fellowshipping, they wanted to be involved with that sharing. And then he goes on to talk about working out the desirous will of God. And this is in 2 Corinthians chapter 8 and verse 5. In 2 Corinthians chapter 8 and verse 5, it says, and not just as we had hoped, but themselves they gave first to the Lord, and also and us through the desirous will of God. This is something actually that's really important to pay a lot of attention to, is the desirous will of God in our lives. Do you understand what the desirous will of God is for your life? Knowing the desirous will of God is probably one of the things that we as Christians primarily should focus on in our Christian life. Why? Because it's going to pretty much cover every aspect of our Christian life when you really begin to understand it, because you're seeking to do the desirous will of God, which means you have to follow the Spirit and you have to follow his desires, because he's never going to have a desire that's contrary to the desirous will of God, ever. Which also means you're going to be spiritual. Present your bodies as a living sacrifice, Romans chapter 12 and verse 1. Now, in the way that this is described here in Romans chapter 12 and verse 1, it is a one-time thing. So we don't keep on doing this. But it is a one-time thing that if you honestly do it, you're going to recognize the fact that, hey, Christ died for my sins and he was resurrected to save me. He paid my penalty. The least I can do is present my body as belonging to him because he paid for it. Which means I am going to tend to pay more attention to how I use my body. Romans chapter 12, verse 1, therefore I encourage you, brethren, through the compassions of God, to present your bodies as a living sacrifice. It's not mercies, as some translations, because mercy focuses on sin. Compassion is the pity that God has upon us in the bodies we're in right now. He had pity on us. As it describes here, our reasonable religious response to this should be, or our reasonable responses should be in religious service to present our bodies as a living sacrifice. They belong to him. That, by the way, is an important first step in relation to doing the desirous will of God. Because if you're not going to recognize that God owns your body, some of the other ones aren't going to be as effective. It would encompass, some of your spiritual sacrifices are going to come as a result of this. Otherwise, if you're not willing to present your body as a living sacrifice, there's some aspects of God's desirous will you're not going to do. So it's not required, but if you don't do it, again, there's some areas you're just not going to follow what God wants. And it's going to cause some problems in your life. So yeah, this would be a good thing to, again, recognize the fact that our bodies belong to God. In the end, where are we going to end up? Regardless of what happens to us, whether we have a wonderful life down here on earth or a terrible life, where are we going to end up? In heaven, right next to Christ, because he's the one who purchased our bodies. It's totally reasonable. Now, because we actually have a renewed mind, we're to actually use it. This is actually part of God's desirous will. Actually, we can't determine what God's desirous will is unless we're using our renewed mind. So this is in Romans chapter 2 and verse 12, where we have another aspect of God's desirous will for us. And stop being outwardly conformed to this age. In the context, the age is talking about legal. Stop being a legalist. We don't live by law, we live out from grace. We live by faith. But be transformed by the renewed mind. You have two words there, conformed and transformed. Conformed means you're putting a mask on. Transformed means you're beginning to show outwardly what is inwardly. But be transformed by your renewed mind. Remember, as we've gone over this before, and it's a good reminder, renew is not a verb. You are not renewing your mind. You possess a renewed mind. Start using it. Being transformed by your renewed mind for the purpose to test for approval what is the desirous will of God. Well, that is required in order for me to actually look at a situation and say, hey, is this something God wants me to be involved with or not? What's God's desirous will for me in this situation? I have to use my renewed mind. Why? Because if I don't use my renewed mind, what kind of a mindset am I going to use? It's going to be based upon emotions, based upon how it makes me feel, not about what God desires for me. Because a mind that's focused on the soul, the emotional, isn't going to understand the things of God. They're not going to make sense. Because, hey, then sometimes it's not pleasant for us. Now, in the end, it's going to be much better for us, but we don't see that starting out. We see that it doesn't feel so good. We can, to some degree, use an analogy of exercising on this one. Because when you start out exercising, it's not so pleasant. But in the end, it actually does, in most cases, is very beneficial for you. But our desire would be not to exercise because it's hard. Not doing what God wants. Another aspect of God's desirous will is to use your spiritual gift. Now, spiritual gifts, by the way, are not something we're supposed to be ignorant about. Spiritual gifts are not people going around perceiving that they're seeing visions and dreams and speaking in words that don't mean anything to anybody. This is not spiritual gifts. Spiritual gifts, and in 1 Corinthians chapter 12, Paul says, I don't want you to be ignorant about spiritual gifts. Now, in the beginning of the church, there were specific spiritual gifts that related to revelation. Speaking in tongues was a good example of that. Speaking in tongues was not speaking in gibberish. Speaking in tongues was speaking in another language that you do not know, and you were speaking the wonderful works of God as a sign to the Jews. Which means, because most of the Jews actually knew multiple languages, you'd have this guy coming in that they know. These would be those from Galilee. They're like, these people have never left Galilee. We know they don't know another language. And yet they're sitting here telling me the wonderful works of God in the language from the place that I grew up in. How is that even possible? Well, it's because God is the one who's actually showing. Wasn't gibberish. Speaking in tongues today is gibberish, and it's garbage. It's from another spirit. It is not the Holy Spirit who's involved with that. And I know there's a lot caught up in that, and they don't understand it. And they don't understand it because they really don't want to look at the truth of what Scripture says. What they're really focused on is how it makes them feel emotionally. But Christianity is not about your emotions. Christianity is, it starts up here in the logics. It's not to say we ignore our emotions, but it always starts with the rational. God spoke the truth. Healing. Healing is not active today because healing was used as a sign for the Jews. Now, what I mean by healing here, I'm not saying God doesn't heal people today, because he absolutely does. But this is the kind of healing where a person walks into a hospital and the hospital goes bankrupt. Why? Because all the patients get up and walk out and they're completely healed. This is what God did. I mean, look at the examples you get with the apostles afterward. Even if their shadow hits somebody, they heal. That's pretty incredible. And that's really obvious. It's not like today where this person healed this person and that, and you can never find the person who was healed. Or they claim to be healed, but really the person never are healed. And they don't actually heal the sick people. But we have spiritual gifts that we need to use. What are those? Active spiritual gifts. They are the gifts that edify the body today. We don't need prophecy because we have the full revelation. The church at the beginning absolutely needed prophecy. They didn't have the full revelation. But we don't need that now. We have pastors, we have teachers, and then we have all of those that relate to the edification of the church, administration, helps, giving, all of those aspects of being a part of one body. We all have one spiritual gift, and we're to know it and use it. God wants us using it. It is a spiritual gift, so it's not necessarily something that you're good at. Well, at first you might not be very good at it. You should become really good at it. You should be able to apply it properly. And that's actually part of God's desirous will for you. He gave you a spiritual gift. He wants you to use it. There's also one other aspect of using your spiritual gift. Guess what? You have to be around people. Not just any people. You have to be around other saints. Don't forget the assembling of each other together. I know in our day and age, it's all about electronics and it's all about, being online and other stuff like that. If you can get to an assembly, you need to be in an assembly. It's different if you're just not able to, where God has not provided an opportunity for you to be able to do that. But otherwise, you need to be around other saints so that you can use those spiritual gifts. 1 Corinthians 12:18. But now the God set forth members, each one of them in the body, just as he desirously willed. Those positions that we have within the body, and he goes on to describe them similar to the eyes, the ears, the hands. Those are all by the desirous will of God. If it's his desirous will to have those within the body, it would make sense it's his desirous will for us to use them, wouldn't it? Give yourself to the Lord and then to other believers. This is what they did. The Macedonian saints, being extremely poor, they first gave themselves to the Lord, and then they said, hey, we want to express some love towards other saints. Now, remember, this love is not just a warm feeling that they were after. What were they doing? They're saying, hey, these saints need assistance. They need assistance with basic necessities. We're going to help. I have a little bit extra. I'm going to give it to them. You know, and that's their focus. But at first they gave themselves to the Lord. And then they're looking at, hey, in doing that, we can help other saints. Which would also mean they weren't trying to brag about how they were helping other people. And they weren't trying to help beyond their own means. You know, that's something that is important for us to learn. When God gives us a task to do, he's going to give us what we need to do it. And if we don't have anything left and we want to do more, that means that's not that part. It's not for us. Let God fill that up with someone else. 2 Corinthians 8:5, and not just as we had hoped, but they first gave themselves to the Lord and us through the desirous will of God. Now he's talking about them giving financial support to the saints. It is God's desirous will that we serve the Lord, even with our emotions. Now, we do focus a lot on, and we should properly, on the rational part of Christianity. But that doesn't mean that you can't have emotions towards it. It does mean you should not allow your emotions to dictate and guide you. That's going to get you in trouble. We have a lot of that today. You go into many of these assemblies today that call themselves Christians, and what's it all about? Well, worship service. But worship service is really just about making you sing songs of vain repetition to make yourself feel good. It's not about truth. But we don't ignore our emotions either. Ephesians chapter 6, verses 6 and 7. Not according to eye service as men pleasers, but as servants of the Christ, doing the desirous will of God out from the soul, with a good mind, serving as to the Lord and not to men. Out from the soul would be your emotions. So your emotions are involved in it. Enjoy what you're doing. Nothing wrong with that. Be set apart. That is sanctified, and abstain from fornication. Yeah, we as Christians, especially the younger ones, should abstain from fornication. That's something the world system doesn't want us to abstain from. The world system wants all kinds of things involved in sexual perversions, especially now there's a real big focus on that, and there's an intent for that. And what I mean by that is it's not just for your pleasure. The world system is seeking to manipulate people through this. And you'll see that through history. Sometimes it's acceptable, sometimes it's not, but it's always for an agenda. And that's what they're trying to do. But the reality is, there is absolutely no reason to not wait until marriage. That's most appropriate. Set yourself apart. You belong to God. Abstain from fornication. 1 Thessalonians chapter 4, verses 3 through 5, actually. For this is the desirous will of God. Now that's really obvious there. For this is the desirous will of God. Your sanctification, you being set apart, abstain from fornication. Each one of you to know how to possess his own vessel in sanctification and honor, not in passions of desire, not allowing the passions from the sin nature to rule us, just as also the Gentiles who don't know God. We don't do the things that they do. We separate ourselves. Be thankful for and in everything. Being thankful is a result of being spiritual. You can't force being spiritual by forcing yourself to be thankful. And a good example of this is you can't love somebody by saying, well, I don't have to like them, but I have to love them. It's kind of the wrong mentality, because really you're saying, well, I'm just going to have to do this before you because I have to love you. But love is going to seek the best for the one loved. Being appreciative of what you have is going to start with understanding who God is. And really, actually, in our communication, what do we always start with? Worship. Giving God credit for who he is, what he's done. And we're going to start being more appreciative of the opportunity that we have. We can even be thankful when life really is terrible and we're being tempted all the time. Why? Why would I be thankful for temptations around me, especially temptations that I have a really hard time dealing with? Because that testing is going to prove whether I'm taking God at his word or not. And if I'm failing, it means I'm not taking God at his word, and I should stop and start taking God at his word. And guess what happens? I start actually winning. 1 Thessalonians 5:18, and in everything give thanks, for this is the desirous will of God in Christ for you. Experientially know the riches of the glory of the indwelling Christ. This is not, you know them. This is not, get yourself a list and memorize a list. That's not this kind of knowledge. This is actually experiencing. Is your faith real? Not I believe because mommy and daddy told me or took me to church, but is your faith actually real? Have you actually experienced God? And I'm not talking in an emotional sense, I'm talking in an actual rational sense. One of the good examples of experiencing God is take him at his word when it comes to dealing with the sin nature. And watch what happens when a temptation comes upon you and you apply the truth, know, reckon, and yield. I have died with Christ. I have been raised to walk in newness of life, and I'm going to start yielding my members to righteousness. And all of a sudden you have not only victory over those desires that the ones that really used to actually overcome you, you lose interest in them completely because you're taking God at his word. That's experiencing it. Experientially know the riches of the glory of the indwelled Christ. 1 Corinthians chapter 1 and verse 27. To whom the God desirously willed to make known to you what is the wealth of the glory. Remember, glory is a proper opinion. Good example of having a proper opinion is, am I a sinner saved by grace or am I a saint? See the different mentality there? I'm a saint, according to what God says. I was a sinner, but I'm no longer a sinner. I shouldn't have the mentality I'm just a sinner. I just keep on failing. That's me. No. God took that away. I need to have a proper opinion of the mystery among the Gentiles, which is Christ in you, the hope of glory. Know it. Live it. You know, God wants us to ask for ourselves. Yeah, there's nothing wrong with going and asking for other people to pray for you. But really, in doing that, I'd have to bring up, have you asked for yourself? Because he wants us to ask why. Because again, that goes back to, especially when we ask correctly, we're going to weigh the situation and we're going to look at his desirous will and we're going to ask according to his desirous will, and we're going to receive it. Because in some cases, we're going to be like, yeah, well, really, maybe I shouldn't be asking for that because it's really for my own desires. It's not really a way for me to manifest who I am. Good example again of this is a job that pays more money, but in order to take that job that pays more money, you're not around any saints. That's not beneficial to you. Financially it might be beneficial, but spiritually it's not beneficial at all. 1 John chapter 5, verses 14 through 15. And this is the confidence that we have facing him, that if we should happen to ask according to his will, he hears us. And if we intuitively know that he hears us, well, we should happen to ask, we intuitively know that we have the thing that we have asked for. It works. Goes back, by the way, to experientially knowing the richness of the indwelt Christ, because you're asking according to the will of God. Do good in every part and manner of your life of living. Do good in every aspect. We do good by applying what God has given to us. We don't do good through our own works. We do good through really using what God has actually provided for us, and that produces proper works. 1 Peter chapter 2 and verse 15 and 16. Because of this, or because this is the desirous will of God, while doing good to silence the ignorance of foolish men. Think about that. That means we're going to be around situations where people are doing things bad, and we're going to do them right. We're going to do them good. We're going to get mocked for it, but we're still going to do good. Why? Because in the end, whose mouth is going to be silenced? The one doing things wrong or the one doing things right? Our focus should be on doing the things right. And of course, that does mean that we are going to suffer in some circumstances because of our testimony. Because we're doing it right, people are going to mock us. And that's, that's the way life is. 1 Peter chapter 3 and verse 17, for it is better while doing good, if we desiriously will, the desirous will of God to suffer than while doing wrong. Doing good. The next one, which I do believe is 1 Peter chapter 4 and verse 19, that is, wherefore also the suffering according to the desirous will of God, as to a faithful creator, while entrusting our souls in doing good. So two different aspects of them. Live the remaining time in the will of God and not to the desirous will of the flesh. Think about that. That should be our focus. Now we go back to the Corinthian saints, and what were they doing? They wanted to give, and Paul was like, financially, you guys can't really afford it. But instead of pushing it, what they decided to do was first give themselves to the Lord, and then as they saw an opportunity, they were going to actually express love towards other saints. I said the Macedonians, you're right, because he was showing that to the Corinthian saints. It was the Macedonian saints that were actually doing that. Pretty incredible. We should know the desirous will of God. This, by the way, would be something that would be good to write down. Write down in the sense that, am I doing these things? Because in any situation in our lives, these things that are revealed about God's desirous will guarantee we will be able to determine what God's desirous will is.